Greetings, fellow travelers through the liturgical year. This is Lisa Davis with not so much a feast day quick take as several amazing saints not so quick take. Dan says to call it a long take. But oh my goodness, such amazing stories of the saints to cover that are seldom brought to our attention. The more you look into these heroes of the faith, the more amazing heroes you find, one linking to another and another and another in a glorious net of grace stretching from heaven to earth. I could probably do a 5-hour long take, but to keep it a reasonable length, I trimmed back to only the highlights of the following 15 or so martyrs, and didn't delve too much into the complicated history of the time between King Henry VIII and Charles II. Suffice it to say, starting with Henry VIII's loss of the faith, things were tough for Catholics in the British Isles. But when the going gets tough, you know how the tough get going. Grace flies everywhere, and people who you might least expect to become intrepid warriors for Christ reach out for some of that grace and use it in the most brave and daring ways, all for the glory of God and loyalty to His holy church. Pull up a comfy chair or snuggle into your car seat if you're driving, but keep your eyes on the road, and join me on a little investigation into the English martyrs of the Protestant Revolt. Between the reign of Henry VIII and Charles II, roughly 1535 through 1681, a minimum of 600 English Catholics died for the Catholic faith, specifically for the primacy of the Roman pontiff, which we'll talk more about momentarily. Pope Leo XIII beatified 54 of these martyrs in 1888 and 9 more in 1895. 247 others had their cause of beatification introduced in 1886 and were declared venerable. 29 were beatified in 1929 by Pope Pius XI. The remainder, almost 300, though they died heroically, led more obscure lives that presented obstacles to their official observations, so their martyrdoms were known, but their veneration could not become public. Now, it's just good to know the Novus Ordo canonized 40 of these martyrs in 1970 and compiled them in one feast day they titled the 40 Holy Martyrs of England and Wales. And though it is highly likely these holy men and women are enjoying the beatific vision, officially we can consider them only beatified and call them blessed. Except for St. Thomas More and St. John Fisher, who were canonized by Pope Pius XI in 1935, you won't see the names of the following martyrs on our traditional calendars. They're fairly unknown, though the stories of their lives and their deaths are astounding, the stuff of legend, tales that at one time bards would have transformed into epic poems. Movies should be made about the adventures of these men and women. So a little history first. Unfortunately, it's not only because they're not on the calendar, but because the adage is true. The victor writes the history. The victory of Protestantism over the true faith in England has almost erased the valor of these heroes of the faith. They were vilified in the English tongue in their own day, and even today the UK suppresses and rewrites the truth of these martyrdoms. It's not good PR to admit the full story of the British persecution of Catholics during the so-called Reformation. Consider the specks in black and white. It's not pretty. This was religious persecution perpetrated by an arguably mad, most definitely immoral king who made up his own religion because he couldn't have his way. Henry wanted a new queen because his old one was unable to produce an heir. The Pope refused to go along with Henry's plan to put away his legal wife or to bend the laws of the church to appease its unruly and prideful child. So Henry lashed out in every way possible, causing as much pain and suffering as possible. He made up his own religion, allowing divorce, then murdered 2 of his 6 wives instead of divorcing them. Don't try to make sense of it, you can't. And, of course, he had to eradicate Catholicism in his kingdom. King Henry VIII began his history of murdering people who bothered his conscience a year before he beheaded Anne Boleyn, his first faux replacement wife. Because they refused to take the oath of supremacy, Carthusian prior Father John Houghton and two of his brothers in religion, Robert Lawrence and Augustine Webster, were hanged, drawn, and quartered on the 4th of May, 1535. Suffice it to say for the uninitiated, being hanged, drawn, and quartered was the most painful and ignominious death in the British repertoire of the day, not unlike crucifixion at the time of our Lord. Shortly after the murder of the Carthusians, Henry saw to the hanging of St. John Fisher, who also steadfastly maintained his loyalty first and always to the Roman Catholic Church, and refused the oath of supremacy. Before I go further, I should probably clarify that the oath of supremacy was the formal vow of fealty to King Henry VIII, literally requiring the British nobility and all subjects in public or ecclesiastical office to swear their loyalty to the British crown, above and before the Pope and the Catholic Church. To refuse to take the oath was a death warrant. Henry and his evil counselors labeled it an act of treason, because calling out the sins of the king was surely treasonous, right? But Henry manufactured his new religion to be part and parcel of his right and rule over his subjects. And keep in mind that England in this era was pretty much perpetually at war with loudly, proudly Catholic nations, first France and then Spain. Catholicism was therefore propagandized by the crown as taking sides with the enemy. And sheeple then, same as sheeple now, most of the common people, and the not-so-common people, the nobility and office holders too, gravitated toward the path of least resistance. They willingly believed whatever they were told to believe, and gleefully participated in virtue-signaling the righteousness of Henry's new order religion, if for no other reason than to keep their necks out of the noose. Many didn't hesitate to snitch on friends, neighbors, and even family they suspected of having anti-establishment or popish inclinations. Nothing new to see here. It was all about political correctness. You find it all over history, from the thousands upon thousands who perished in Noah's flood for stubbornly sticking to the evil status quo, to people who kowtowed to the Pharisees in the Holy Land during the time of Christ, to the Protestant Revolt we're remembering today, to many of the circumstances surrounding the 2 world wars, to the pandemic and the woke idiocracy of our own time. Sad but true, the vast majority of people do what's easiest. Every once in a while, the world is blessed with a St. Vincent Ferrer or a St. Francis Xavier, both who converted thousands. But too often in the annals of history, it's the slick and slippery but loud voice of power-hungry heretics and hedonists that convert thousands. And those who resist and go in the opposite direction are considered either mad or enemies of the people. St. Anthony the Great, a saint born in the 3rd century, called it early on. There will come a time, he said, when men will go mad, and when they see someone who is not mad, they will attack him saying, "You are mad, you are not like us." Knuckle bump to all the mad Catholics out there today. God bless you for your strength of conviction and your courage. But I digress. Back to St. John Fisher. A bishop and chancellor of Cambridge University, he was raised to the cardinalate by Pope Paul III shortly before Fisher's death on June 22, 1535. The Pope's point in doing such a thing? To show the world the value the Church placed on Bishop Fisher and his refusal of the oath, and to thumb the Church's collective nose at King Henry VIII. And there's a good piece of Catholic untrivial trivia here. St. John Fisher is the only cardinal in the history of the Church to have been martyred. Our next saint, as mentioned, is one of only 2 that have been canonized, and is quite well known, partly due to the contemporary movie and play Man for All Seasons. But mostly, I think, because, as the books and movies show, he was holy, wise, courageous, and unforgettably well-spoken. I think most Catholics know St. Thomas More belongs to this era of persecution in the Church. Layman, lawyer, judge, and Chancellor of England, St. Thomas More also refused to swear the oath of supremacy, and though he tried to avoid the executioner through legal means, he met his pious demise the same year as Cardinal Fisher and the Carthusians, on July 6, 1535. Before being dispatched by the headsman's axe, he left us with the famous parting words, "I die the King's good servant and God's first." To learn more about St. Thomas More, the movie A Man for All Seasons, especially the Paul Scofield version, is a classic. If you haven't seen it, by all means go find it. It's excellent. We also recommend the book A Man Born Again by John Bean, and we do have a feast day quick take honoring St. Thomas More that we can try to remember to link in the show notes. God be thanked for men such as St. John Fisher and St. Thomas More. Both names that probably ring a bell for most Catholics, but these two are just the tip of the holy iceberg of this era in the Church. Hundreds of Catholics died equally as courageously during this era, young and old men and women. Far more men than women, as you might suppose. But the Protestant Inquisition was not averse to trying, torturing, and executing the fairer sex. Of particular note are the three Margarets, or, because Margaret from the Greek means pearl, we can call them the three pearls of England. Margaret Pole was a member of the nobility, a peer of the realm, a rare thing for a woman in the 16th century, and one of the few surviving members of the House of Plantagenets after the War of the Roses. Born in August 1473, she was the mother of Reginald Pole, the last Catholic Archbishop of Canterbury, and a loyal Catholic who was raised to the cardinalate and was, poor man, the papal legate to England during much of Henry's disastrous attempt at bargaining with Rome for an annulment. Margaret Pole was also the first cousin once removed of Henry VIII, but kinship to the royal family probably hurt more than helped her, as her involvement in the hiding of priests was a particular affront and an embarrassment to Henry. Because he wanted to try to keep his cousin's betrayal as quiet as possible, the king ordered a private execution without a trial. Margaret was beheaded on the morning of May 27, 1541, at the age of 68, though some historians believe she was older, possibly in her 80s, which goes to show that venerable age didn't inspire mercy in Henry Tudor any more than kinship. Lady Margaret Pole was beatified by Pope Leo XIII on the 29th of December, 1886. Margaret Clitherow, born in 1556, was a woman of simpler means and humbler parentage. Her father was a wax chandler, or candle merchant, and a local sheriff, and her husband, when she married at the tender age of 15, was a well-to-do butcher. Margaret, an especially bright young woman, excelled at running the particulars of her husband's business, and was well respected by all. Proof of her intelligence, she converted to Roman Catholicism at the age of 18, and though her husband John never converted, he was supportive, and not surprisingly so, as his brother William was a Catholic priest, and likely involved in Margaret's conversion. At this time in the evolution of Catholic persecution in Protestant England, British citizens' attendance at the Church of England services was mandatory and carefully recorded. Community members who didn't show up on Sunday mornings were reported to the authorities, and Margaret was always on the no-show list. The first warnings issued to the Clitherows levied a fine, which Margaret's husband paid. But eventually, Margaret's continued absence at the Protestant church resulted in prison sentences. Her third child, in fact, was born in prison. At this time, the wheels of Protestant tyranny considered Margaret's infractions minor. However, missing services was not a capital offense. Little did the inquisitors realize, however, that this young mother was one of the movers and shakers of the Catholic underground, who risked her life daily by harboring and maintaining priests, a crime that was considered a capital offense in these days of terror. It's crazy to imagine, but it seems Margaret was particularly suited to this task. Perhaps because a young, attractive mother running a butcher's shop drew little suspicion, she seemed to have little trouble flying under the radar. Her careful management, as well as the support she was able to glean from other secret Catholics, enabled her to provide 2 different locations where priests were hidden and Mass was celebrated, even though spies permeated every strata of society and rewards were given for informing on Catholics. Margaret's home became one of the most important hiding places for fugitive priests in the north of England. Undetected, she operated this clandestine circuit for several years, until 1586, when she sent her son Henry to the English college in Reims to study for the priesthood. This began the unraveling of the Clitherows. The powers that be got wind of young Henry's removal to Catholic Europe, which fact, together with Margaret's long history of skipping church services, initiated an official inquiry. The Clitherows' home was searched, and when a frightened child revealed one of the priest holes, the jig was up. To save her children from having to testify, Margaret refused to plead, which prevented a trial but didn't save her life, of course. The sentence imposed was intended to bring about a confession, something the Crown would never get from Margaret Clitherow, who had seen the holy martyrdom of priests and didn't fear it for herself. When urged to confess her crime, she answered, "No, no, I die for the love of my Lord Jesus." And this was her manner of death. Placing a sharp rock beneath her spine, the Church of England piled an immense weight of stones on a door placed on her stomach, until the weight caused her spine to break. According to the accounts of the day, this took 15 long minutes. This was on Good Friday, 1586. Margaret was pregnant with her 4th child. 2 people were murdered that day. But her 2 sons, William and Henry, did go on to be priests, and her daughter Anne became a nun. Beatified by Pope Pius XI in 1929, Margaret Clitherow is known today as the Pearl of York. She is considered a patroness of businesswomen, and has also been adopted by at least one British Latin Mass society as an intercessor. Also beatified by Pope Pius XI in 1929 was another pearl, Margaret Ward, the Pearl of Tyburn. Also executed during the reign of Elizabeth I, little is known of her life, except that she was, as the Catholic Encyclopedia says, of a good family and a gentlewoman. It's believed she may have been a lady's companion, but as gently born as it seems she was, Margaret Ward was clearly an exceedingly brave Catholic. She took Margaret Clitherow's boldness and went a step further, helping Nicholas Owen, whose story we'll also tell, to devise and carry out a priest's escape from Bridewell prison. Alban Butler tells us that, quote, her story is largely part of Father Watson's, and truly so, as his rescue claimed the martyr's crown for her. The gist of the bold plan was this. Margaret would find a way to meet and make friends with the wife of Father Watson's jailer, then wheedle her way into the woman's confidence until she was trusted enough to bring food to the priest, and eventually smuggle a length of rope to Father for his escape out his high window. On the River Thames, just below the prison walls, 2 Catholic watermen would intercept Father after he climbed down from his window and row him to safety. A daring scheme, but it worked. Barely. Father escaped, but with a broken leg and arm. Because the rope was too short, he had to let go and jump. According to some accounts, John Roche, an Irishman, who may have been one of the watermen and may have been a volunteer who happened by, carried him to the river. When we get to the story of Nicholas Owen, it'll be obvious why he wasn't the one to rescue Father. As the men rowed away from the prison, Father Watson exchanged clothes with John Roche and lived to pray another day, God be thanked. But, after depositing Father safely ashore, John Roche, dressed in Father's prison clothes, was apprehended. The rope hanging from the side of the prison was easily traced back to Margaret Ward, and she and John Roche were tried together. According to Jesuit priest and martyr-in-the-making Robert Southwell, who was also imprisoned at the time, Margaret Ward was, quote, flogged and hung up by the wrists, the tips of her toes only touching the ground, for so long a time that she was crippled and paralyzed. But these sufferings greatly strengthened the glorious martyr for her last struggle. Margaret and John were both offered freedom if they asked the Queen's pardon and agreed to, quote, confirm the established church. But they refused, and were both hanged at Tyburn on the 30th of August, 1588. Both Margaret Ward and John Roche were beatified, together with Margaret Pole and Margaret Clitherow, by Pope Pius XI in 1929. Blessed Edmund Campion is another name familiar to many Catholics. Born to middle-class Catholics who lost the faith during his childhood, Edmund Campion grew up Anglican. But by the grace of God, he was inspired as a young adult to leave a promising career at Oxford and snub an invitation to join the service of Queen Elizabeth in order to follow his conscience in a reversion to the Catholic faith, ultimately finding his calling in the priesthood. He was ordained in Belgium in 1573 and soon afterward entered the Society of Jesus. A renowned teacher and orator at the Jesuit seminary in Prague, his intelligence, piety, and quick mind recommended him to the Jesuit Superior General's notice in Rome, and he was among the first to be sent to operate covert missions throughout the persecuted Catholic Church in England. And the adventure begins. When he first debarked in England in June 1580, disguised as a jewel merchant, Father Campion's first communication from the underground was to, "Quick, don't waste a minute, discard your disguise and blend into the crowd." His cover had been blown before he'd even stepped off the gangway at the port of London. Undaunted, Father managed to evade capture and thanked God for the honest introduction to his new life. Zealous for souls, he wasted no time beginning his preaching and teaching career right under the nose of the enemy. Prey of the state from the first day, he never cowered, but stayed on the offensive, seeking not only to bring the Mass and sacraments to persecuted Catholics, but to convert the fallen away as well. He printed tracts against the errors of Anglicanism and distributed them throughout the kingdom everywhere he traveled administering the sacraments. His path zigzagged from secret location to secret location through Berkshire, Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, and Lancashire until July of 1581, when he was captured by the treachery of a spy in the ranks of the faithful and was taken in chains to the Tower of London. He'd only worked for the cause of the Church in England for a little more than a year. Imprisoned for about 4 months, Father Campion was tortured on the infamous rack. But more painful to our priest was the calumny, the lies told about him, claiming he had retracted his profession of faith and given in to the Church of England. But it wasn't long before he was vindicated. After a sham trial, Blessed Edmund Campion and several companions, refusing to bend the knee in the oath of supremacy, were found guilty of treason and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. At his sentencing, Blessed Edmund Campion is quoted as saying, "In condemning us, you condemn all your ancestors, all our ancient bishops and kings, all that was once the glory of England, the island of saints, and the most devoted child of the See of Peter." He and his companions, Ralph Sherwin and Alexander Bryant, received their crowns in heaven on the 1st of December, 1581. Edmund Campion was one of the English martyrs beatified by Pope Leo XIII in 1886. A good book detailing such holy adventures is the autobiography of a hunted priest, the first-hand account of a member of the British nobility who had become a Jesuit, Father John Gerard. He was not himself a martyr, undoubtedly by the grace of God, so that he could leave us a record of these holy martyrs and give us an idea of what their lives were like. But Father Gerard had many close scrapes. He knew everyone who was anyone in the Catholic underground around the turn of the 17th century. In his autobiography, Father takes us through the hidden byways, secret tunnels, and into the priest holes of the Catholic underground. And among many other incidents, he tells us of his own capture and escape from the Tower of London. This isn't the story of a martyrdom, but Father Gerard's life skirted for many years the narrow ledge between life and death in England. His boldest escape is believed to have been the brainchild of lay Jesuit Nicholas Owen. Here he is again, more on him in a minute. In October 1597, with the help of outside conspirators from the Catholic underground, Father Gerard, along with fellow prisoner John Arden, get this, escaped on a rope strung across the tower moat in the inky darkness of a moonless night. Despite his hands being mangled from torture, Father Gerard managed to inch across the rope and make it to safety, followed by John Arden. And proof of Father's common sense and good Catholic charity, knowing he would be held responsible for allowing his prisoner to escape, Father Gerard also took along with them the jailer who had guarded his cell. Other adventures and near misses ensued, as father was more than ever a wanted man, but he carried on, sure of the necessity of his labors for souls, until the chaos of the gunpowder plot had him recalled by the church out of the mission field. Escaping the country, hidden in the retinue of the Spanish ambassador, he wound up his priestly vocation in Catholic Europe, teaching, and, by order of his superiors, recording the adventures of his life in England. He died in 1637 at the age of 73, no doubt disappointed that he hadn't won the palm of martyrdom alongside so many of his friends. Father Gerard is one of several of the most famous characters of the time just before and after the gunpowder plot, a moment in history made famous or infamous by the continued observation of Guy Fawkes Day in the UK. Still a thing even now, the British actually burn effigies of Guy Fawkes, the fall man of what has since been revealed to have probably been a fake plot manufactured by the Crown to encourage and inflame public opinion against Catholics. What was the gunpowder plot? It names the scheme supposedly devised in 1605 by a rogue band of Catholics to blow up the House of Lords, the idea being that this would somehow instigate a change of government and call a cease to Catholic persecution. If it was indeed instigated by Catholics, I'm not sure what they had in mind. Suffice it to say, if it were Catholics at the heart of it, the plan was ill-advised, poorly contrived, forbidden by the Church, and a failure. No gunpowder blew up, no Church of God Brits were killed, and the fact that an assassination attempt was permitted to be set up in so public a place that was supposed to have been heavily guarded was considered as dubious at the time as it sounds now. Does the scenario sound familiar? As mentioned, many believed the supposed plot could have been a double-cross designed to kindle hatred and distrust for Catholics. But it's not a settled science, so to speak. We may never know. What we do know is that its after effects made life exponentially more difficult for Catholics in England, especially for priests. Anyway, back to our martyrs. One last word about Father Gerard. Father Henry Garnet, whose heroic story is coming up, wrote about him. Twice he has been hung up by the hands with great cruelty on the part of others, and no less patience on his own. The examiners say he is exceedingly obstinate, and a great friend either of God or of the devil, for they say they cannot extract a word from his lips, save that amidst his torments he speaks the word Jesus. Recently they took him to the rack where the torturers and examiners stood ready for work. But when he entered the place, he at once threw himself on his knees, and with a loud voice prayed to God that he would give him strength and courage to be rent to pieces before he might speak a word that would be injurious to any person or to the divine glory. And seeing him so resolved, they did not torture him. The day Father Gerard managed under obedience to escape England, looking as inconspicuous as he could, tucked in amongst another crowd of Spanish servants, God bless the Spanish, his friend Father Henry Garnet, quoted above, was facing his execution. Father Garnet, another Jesuit, is distinguished for being a martyr of the seal of the confessional. The British executed him allegedly because he had some kind of advanced knowledge of the gunpowder plot through the confession of one of the conspirators. Ordained a Jesuit in Rome, 1582, Father Garnet was chosen to accompany the Jesuit mission to England in 1586, eventually becoming the superior of the mission. Ironically, Father Garnet was a particularly staunch opponent to violence by Catholics and advised and preached against it widely. Nevertheless, after the foiling of the gunpowder plot, all stops were pulled in order to force information from anyone supposedly involved. And Father, due to his connection to others already arrested for their involvement, was called in for questioning. In particular, regarding a confession he was said to have heard from one of the key suspects, a man named Robert Catesby. Father was proven to be as innocent of involvement in any kind of nefarious plot as a person could be, but that wasn't the question. What the inquisitors wanted was information on Catesby, and the only thing that would save Father's life was for him to break the seal of the confessional, which he, of course, would not do. Father Henry Garnet was hanged on the 3rd of May, 1606, but he was not drawn and quartered, as the largely Protestant crowd, realizing the priest's innocence, pulled on his legs to hurry his death, so that the remainder of the punishment couldn't be accomplished. It's said that when his head was placed on a pole on London Bridge, his countenance shone with, quote, so fresh and lifelike appearance that the people petitioned that his face be turned from view. They could not bear the reproach in his eyes. The martyrs of this time are linked by the faith first, of course, but also by friendship in hard times. Among most of these heroic Catholics from Henry VIII to Elizabeth I, there are only 1 or 2 degrees of separation. Many of them served time together in and out of prison at the Tower of London and in the notorious holding cells in Southward known as the Clink. Because there were so few priests, they dared not be caught together, so prison was one of the few places they actually met face to face while in England. We know, for instance, that Father Edmund Arrowsmith's final confession was heard by Father John Southworth, who was also eventually martyred. Jesuit Father John Floyd was arrested while sneaking in to see Father Edward Oldcorne in prison, and they were for a short time able to support one another there. Father Oldcorne, who by the grace of God was able to serve the hidden Catholic mission in England for an unusually long time, 14 years, received the prayers and support of the faithful and his fellow priests to effect a miraculous healing. In November 1601, Father Oldcorne made a pilgrimage to St. Winifred's Well in Holywell in northern Wales to obtain a cure for throat cancer. He was miraculously healed, and in an unusual and courageous show of fraternity during penal times, about 30 Catholics made the return trip to St. Winifred's to give thanks. Several priests attended, including Fathers Garnet and Gerard, and some lay Jesuits, including Nicholas Owen, the ultimate link amongst all the priests, whose story is coming, I promise. Father Oldcorne, though, caught up in the aftermath of the gunpowder plot, was ultimately hanged, drawn, and quartered in 1606, along with several other Jesuit priests and brothers. Another Jesuit, like Father Oldcorne, with an unforgettable name, Brian Edmund Arrowsmith, was related to Father John Gerard through his mother, Marjorie Gerard Arrowsmith, as well as another martyr, Miles Gerard. Young Brian Arrowsmith was nurtured in a stubbornly Catholic family from Lancashire, literally growing up a child of the persecution. One of his grandfathers died in prison for his Catholic convictions, and his family was constantly harassed for his loyalty to the faith. Famous in the annals of the family was the incident when, as a child, Brian was left home alone with his 3 siblings, shivering in his nightclothes after his parents were carted off to the Lancaster jail. But rather than become a cowering victim due to the lifelong ill treatment by the crown, Brian, like a golden arrow, turned his mind and heart heavenward. Strengthened and motivated by the grace of God, he left England at the age of 21 to attend the English college at Douai, taking the name Edmund at his confirmation, after his uncle who was a priest. By 1613, Edmund Arrowsmith had been ordained to the priesthood and later joined the Society of Jesus. After his ordination, he returned to Lancashire, where he labored under cover for souls for 15 years, constantly on the run and always on the alert to avoid arrest, so that he could provide for as long as possible the Mass and the sacraments to the English faithful. In the proclamation against Jesuits, issued in 1591, we get a glimpse of the merry chase these priests gave the crown. Quote, "Because it is known and proved by common experience that they do come into the realm by secret creeks and landing places, disguised both in name and person, some in apparel as soldiers, mariners, or merchants, pretending that they have heretofore been taken prisoner and put into galleys and delivered. Some come as gentlemen with contrary names in comely apparel, as though they had travelled to foreign countries for knowledge, and generally all, for the most part, are clothed like gentlemen in apparel, and many as gallants, yea, in colours and with feathers and such like, disguising themselves, and many of them in their behavior as ruffians, far off to be thought or suspected to be friars, priests, Jesuits, or popish scholars." End quote. The fact that Father Arrowsmith was able to avoid capture and death for 15 years proves God's hand in his missions, but also Father's use of the cleverness God gave him, and his knowledge of the geography. Father's territory consisted chiefly of the area surrounding his childhood home in Lancashire. The estate of his own family, Arrowsmith House, which you can still visit today, was often used as a base of operations. Hiding his vestments, chalice, and altar stone in a nearby cottage, he arrived at the location of the makeshift chapel by way of well-practiced stealth, by dark of night, in disguise, perhaps as a tradesman. Imagine Father Arrowsmith as a chimney sweep, covered in soot, entering through the servants' entrance. He traveled the countryside on foot or by horseback, whichever was least conspicuous, staying overnight in homes, hidden away in special hidden coveys, very often masterminded by one of the most amazing of the Catholic adventurers for Christ, Nicholas Owen. I promise we're getting to him. Nabbed on more than one occasion by Elizabeth's Inquisition, Father Arrowsmith answered his inquisitors so adroitly and with such unflinching charm that the Protestant clergy who attempted to best him in debate in the prison bid him adieu with grudging respect when he was released in 1622 in a political maneuver to appease the Spanish. This was just one of several times Father Arrowsmith was apprehended and managed by the will of God to escape, until finally, in 1628, he was betrayed by a fellow Catholic and at last met his heroic end. His betrayer was a young man, the son of the landlord at the inn in Lancashire where Father was staying. It seems Father Arrowsmith had imposed a penance on the young man and his wife, censoring them for an incestuous marriage because they were first cousins, but they rebelled against Father's admonitions, and in revenge they revealed his hiding place. Their fate is lost to history, but let's hope they repented and turned their lives around. How horrible would it be to have that on your conscience for the rest of your life? Caught unsuspecting, Father Arrowsmith tried to escape, but was captured and imprisoned. After a sham trial, distinguished by the particular rancor of the judge, Sir Henry Yelverton, Father Arrowsmith was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. Yelverton ordered the execution at midday when the townspeople of Lancashire would be busy, so as to avoid a crowd, but no such luck. Father was well known, and the word spread quickly. Looking to heaven, Edmund spoke to the Father Almighty before the gathered crowd, quote, "I die for love of thee, for our holy faith, for the support of the authority of thy vicar on earth, the successor of St. Peter, true head of the Catholic Church, which thou hast founded and established." End quote. All removed, Catholic and Protestant alike. No one in Lancashire could be found to perform the execution, so known and loved was Father Arrowsmith, until a deserter under the same sentence of death agreed to do the deed in exchange for his life. As he approached his execution, Blessed Edmund spoke again. "I freely offer thee my death, O sweet Jesus, in satisfaction for my sins, and I wish this little blood of mine may be a sacrifice for them." He asked for prayers of the Catholics present, then prayed for the king, forgave his persecutors, and asked for forgiveness from all those whom he may have offended. Then, quote, "Be witnesses with me that I die a constant Roman Catholic and for Christ's sake. Let my death be an encouragement to your going forward in the Catholic religion." His confession earlier in the day had been heard by fellow prisoner, soon to be fellow martyr, Blessed John Southworth. His final words were, "O bone Jesu." Jesuit priest Father Edmund Arrowsmith was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Lancaster on August 28, 1628. He was 43 years old. He was another of the British martyrs beatified by Pope Pius XI in 1929. And here's a fascinating addendum to his martyrdom taken from a contemporary account. Quote, "The judge, pleased with the success of the barbarous proceedings, had anticipated the day of execution to have the satisfaction of seeing Father Arrowsmith's death. He was ashamed to appear at the place of execution, but to indulge himself he watched the butchery at a distance through a spyglass. So he feasted his eyes with blood, having first taken an oath not to sit down to table until Arrowsmith was dead. Dinner was ordered in a kind of triumph when his oath was discharged. After dinner some venison came in, a present to the judge. While he admired the venison, Father Arrowsmith's quarters were brought in. To glut himself with horror, he barbarously handled the quarters, laid them by the venison, and was not ashamed inhumanely to compare them together. To complete all, the next day, as he left town, he turned his horse, and making him prance a vainglorious boast of his injustice, he looked toward the martyr's head, and judging it not to be placed high enough, he ordered it to be raised 6 yards upon the pinnacles of the castle. In a little more than a year, justice overtook the inhuman judge, for on the 23rd of January, 1630, the judge, sitting at supper, felt a blow on his head, as it fell into a passion with his servants who waited behind him. But when the servant had protested that he had neither struck him nor seen anyone strike, he received a second blow, like the first, and was carried in great terror to bed, where the next morning he was found struggling with death, dying shortly thereafter." Finally, last but not least, in this tiny fraction of the Tudor martyrs, I can't wrap up without telling about the Jesuit lay brother who has a minor role in the well-loved book by Robert Hugh Benson, Come Rack, Come Rope, but a major role in the history of the heroic Catholics of his time and afterward. Here I'd like to introduce, as promised, Nicholas Owen, an unlikely linchpin in the practical workings of the underground Church of England. He defined the phrase behind the scenes and put the under in underground. Born in Oxford sometime around 1562, Nicholas grew up a child of the persecution. Well nurtured in a devout Catholic family, 2 of his older brothers became priests, but Nicholas didn't aspire so high. God had other plans for the gifted child of a joiner, what we call a carpenter. With the mentorship of his father, Walter Owen, he became a master of an amazingly niche specialty, priest hole building. And following in the other family business, he became a lay Jesuit under the obedience of Father Edmund Campion. When Father Edmund was arrested, Nicholas was thrown into prison for protesting the arrest, but he was released. He then entered the service of the succeeding Jesuit superior, Father Henry Garnet, in about 1588. For the next 18 years, Nicholas Owen perfected his craft, which was protecting priests, enabling the Mass and sacraments to continue to be distributed to a sorely tried population of Catholics who desperately needed them. Known under the pseudonym Little John, or sometimes Little Michael, Nicholas accepted only the necessities of life in exchange for his labors, building hidden cubbyholes, chapels, tunnels, and trap doors to throw the British bloodhounds off the trail. These harbors of safety, hidden in the homes of Catholics all over England, continued to preserve the practice of the faith long after Owen's death even, as the persecutions didn't completely end until the Act of Catholic Emancipation in 1829. If you're doing the math in your head, that's 294 years. But about our carpenter. The descriptions of Nicholas Owen that have survived help explain his ability to stay clear of the crown for as long as he did, and also why he wasn't able to pick up injured Father Watson and carry him to the boat after he helped Margaret Ward rescue him. Nicholas Owen was quite short of stature and suffered from a hernia, as well as having a crippled leg due to an accident in childhood. He presented himself as a poor traveling carpenter, switching out aliases as needed, and was able to avoid notice as much because of his humble boldness as anything else. He was stooped, he had a limp, he carried a patched-up sack of beat-up tools, and claimed to be exactly what he was, a carpenter. No one would have thought to question whether the funny little man, who appeared to be repairing furniture in the neighborhood, was really there to build a priest hole in the house at the end of the block. Building the priest holes alone and in the middle of the night, Nicholas, well aware of disasters like the one in the Clitherow's home, told only the owner of the home where and how to access the priest hole. It is said that many of the locations have been lost to history, though generations of families and many of the old English manors that dot the countryside have passed down the rumor. Nicholas so cleverly contrived the trick entrances that many have yet to be rediscovered. Because of Nicholas Owen's handiwork, priests and other Catholics on the run from British soldiers lived to pray and run away another day. God bless him, Nicholas Owen managed to limp out of countless slippery situations before his final arrest in 1606. After 2 decades of stealth labor and the Crown's discovery of a few examples of his impressive craftsmanship, Nicholas's fame and his name became known. Holed up with another lay brother for 4 days in one of the priest holes he'd built, he was ultimately starved out of hiding and taken in shackles to prison. Realizing the value of the capture, the Secretary of State at the time crowed, quote, "It is incredible how great was the joy that was caused by this arrest, knowing the great skill of Owen in constructing hiding places and the innumerable quantity of dark holes which he had schemed for hiding priests all through England." End quote. As you might imagine, the Protestant inquisitors were keen to extract as much information from Owen as possible. His knowledge of so many hiding places was the key to arresting hundreds of Catholics. But though his torture was exceedingly cruel, not one iota of information passed his lips. He died on the rack during the night of March 1st, 1606, after many hours of torture. Father Gerard, who had been imprisoned at the same time, later wrote of him, "I verily think no man can be said to have done more good of all those who labored in the English vineyard. He was the immediate occasion of saving the lives of many hundreds of persons, both ecclesiastical and secular." Nicholas Owen, humble and hard-working, small and bent, was not someone you would have picked out of a lineup as a hero, but his prayerful efforts touched many lives, saving a large number of them, and provided for the salvation of so many people. Little Nicholas Owen was a giant of a man. You know what they say about hard times making strong people? It's true. They can. And for some blessed few, the fog of the world lifts, priorities become crystal clear, and some of those who have grown strong use that strength to good purpose. Nicholas Owen knew what was important. He didn't rise up to fight the machine. He didn't stand on street corners debating Tudor politics. He risked his life to protect and rescue priests, and to facilitate, by the skill of his hands, the celebration of Mass. No matter what, no matter who was chasing him, no matter what would happen if they caught him. In a letter written in July 1581, Father Robert Parsons, one of the first Jesuits sent to England as a missionary priest, described the heart of the underground Catholics he knew, what they lived for, what they sacrificed for, and what they were willing to die for. "No one," he wrote, "is to be found who complains of the length of services. If Mass does not last nearly an hour, many are discontented. If 6 or 8 Masses are said in the same place on the same day, the same congregation will assist at all." Isn't this humbling? How we take the Mass for granted today, and I do speak for myself. We live in somewhat similar times, but how many of us truly appreciate the treasure of the Holy Sacrifice? We had a taste of religious persecution during the COVID years that maybe a handful of people noticed, but Catholics have suffered ongoing persecution of another kind, an insidious type of persecution since Vatican II, which poisoned the well of Catholic doctrine and perverted the Mass, leaving in the vacuum of faith and tradition a poor imitation of Protestantism, where invalid priests offer Protestant services. For most Catholics, it was painless. They just went along, oblivious. But the remnant, those who clung to the traditional Mass and sacraments and teachings, were vilified by the mainstream religion. Millions in the Novus Ordo have been trained to think of the traditional church as the aberrant sect, similar to the Catholic underground of the Reformation era, without the rack and the hangman's noose. I wonder if more people would wake up to the hijacking of the church if there were torture and martyrdom involved. I'm not sure we should be thankful they're not. Blessed Claude de la Colombière, who was not martyred but suffered many hardships during the English persecutions, summarizes what drove the Catholic remnant to take the risks and make the sacrifices that they did. They knew very well what the Protestants were taking from them. God, Blessed Claude wrote, is more honored by a single Mass than he could be by all the actions of angels and men together, however fervent and heroic they might be. Yet how few hear Mass with the intention of giving God this sublime honor. How few think with joy on the glory a Mass gives to God. How few rejoice to possess the means of honoring him as he deserves. If we only knew the treasure we hold in our hands. End quote. Where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. The definition of heart that applies first is, of course, love or affection. But heart can also mean spirit, courage, and enthusiasm. All virtues, by God's grace, we see as an outpouring of love in these martyrs. Let's pray we all have the heart to fight for our greatest treasure. Even when it's apathy we have to fight. And of course, pray without ceasing for our priests, who daily hold in their consecrated hands this sacred treasure. Never take them for granted. We can't have one without the other. Carthusian Fathers, Blessed John Houghton, Blessed Robert Lawrence, and Blessed Augustine Webster, St. John Fisher, and St. Thomas More. The Pearls of England, Blessed Margaret Pole, Blessed Margaret Clitherow, and Blessed Margaret Ward. Blessed Miles Gerard, Blessed Edmund Campion, Blessed Henry Garnet, Blessed John Southworth, Blessed Edward Oldcorne, Blessed Edmund Arrowsmith, Blessed Claude de la Colombière, Blessed Nicholas Owen, and all your companions, pray for us. Blessed be God in his angels and in his saints. And congratulations to everyone who made it all the way to the end. Give yourself a pat on the back in the comments section. This was a long one.